Hey everyone, and welcome to a brand new video. Just over 2 hours of horror stories as per usual. I hope you all enjoy them. If you do, please be sure to drop a like rating. Let's see if we can reach 1100 likes on this one. Subscribing if you are new is also very much appreciated, as I post videos just like this one every Tuesday. Anyway, sit back, grab a coffee, pack a bowl, whatever it is that you do to relax, enjoy, tell someone you love them, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. As anyone who is or has been the nerdy kid growing up can attest to, you can't help but assume the worst when the biggest bloke in class suddenly walks up to you. It took him calling me by name several times for me to stop pretending like I was reading the blank pages of my notebook. Instead of barraging me with all the usual insults about my glasses, my clothes, or my bowl cut, however, he just grinned down at me and asked, "Oh hey newbie, you play caps?" I shook my head. My folks and I had just moved to town barely a month ago, so I obviously wasn't familiar with the local trends. Bottle caps, or just caps, was apparently an infamous kids game that had recently made its resurgence and was being played across the entire school. I say infamous because many parents saw it as a gateway into subsequent gambling habits, and actively encouraged teachers to be on the lookout for students participating in it. Ironically, that only added to the game's sort of underground appeal. Their concerns weren't unfounded, as kids would often be coaxed by their peers into wagering their allowances or other possessions. The rules are deceptively simple. At the start of a game, each player grabs 4 random bottle caps from the set. Each cap would have a number written on the inside of it, showing the amount of points said cap is worth. The numbers can be 5, 10, 15, 20, or 25. The players then take turns guessing how many points the other has. Every time they are wrong, their opponent must tell them to guess either higher or lower during their next turn. If a player suspects that they are being misdirected, they call their opponent out. A player wins by either guessing the exact number of points their opponent has, catching them lying, or being called out for lying when they actually weren't. Regardless of the outcome, both players flip their caps at the end of the game, revealing their score and proving that they haven't cheated. Needless to say, I lost my lunch money that day, but a few pounds was a small price for the thrill of taking part in something I wasn't supposed to. That's how it started. After a few weeks, my own parents could hardly recognize me. I had stopped studying, which my grades inevitably began to reflect. The only reason I went to school was to play caps with the lads. Probably beginning to suspect what was going on, my mom started packing my lunch instead of giving me money. Unfortunately, that only resulted in me sneaking stuff out of the house that I could gamble with instead. I was much too young to grasp the concept of serious addiction, let alone realize that I was spiraling head first towards it. The others convinced me to stop attending classes altogether. We'd spend our weekdays behind an abandoned gym where we'd smoke, draw on the walls, and of course play caps. But there was also another reason we went there. Once in a while, this old man from across the street would come down and pay us a visit. In hindsight, the guy was clearly unwell. He was grossly malnourished, somehow appearing skinnier and skinnier each time we saw him. His face was covered in scabs and lesions, and his eyes were perpetually bloodshot. He never gave us his name, so we just called him Mr. Seg, on account of his propensity for wearing absurdly oversized jumpers. According to him, he and his friends were the ones who originally came up with our favorite activity. Back when they were around our age, usually he'd just sit there and watch us play for a few hours before going back inside. On occasion, however, he'd challenge one of us to a game, always brandishing the same crumpled €50 note and promising it to whoever beats him. It was an obscene amount of money from the perspective of a 12-year-old back in the early 90s. Not that we'd ever know. You would think that, for a game so reliant on chance. One of us was bound to get lucky eventually. But the old guy always managed to weasel out in the end. Every time it seemed like he was about to lose, he'd suddenly make a random guess which just so happened to be the correct one. We were convinced that he was cheating, but we couldn't figure out how. The bottle caps we used were all the same brand of Coke. There shouldn't have been any way of differentiating between them. He was either being helped by someone, or had one hell of an eye for detail. Perhaps it was time that we tilted the odds in our favor a little bit as well. Cheating at caps is considered a local taboo, and a reliable way of getting your teeth kicked in if caught. Given the circumstances, however, we figured that turnabout is a fair play. A functional set consists of 4 caps from each of the 5 respective values, totaling at 20%. Giving each of them some sort of distinguishing mark would have been too obvious, especially if old Mr. Seg really was that perceptive. To mine and everyone else's surprise, it was I who came up with the idea we eventually ended up going with. The plan was to make a new rigged set made of 16 caps worth the same amount of points. In this case 10, and only 4 of a different one, 15. Only those 4 would be marked in some ideally inconspicuous way so that we could search them out from the rest. The idea was that you'd always know what your opponent has regardless of what they pick, while also being able to ensure that there aren't more than 4 caps of a single value between you two, since that would have given it away. The trap was set. All that was left now was for our guest of honor to make his appearance. Mr. Seg showed up late the following afternoon. He greeted us with the wave and assumed his usual sitting spot, an improvised bench made out of plywood and a few cinder blocks for support. Cooper, the oldest kid in our group, didn't seem keen on waiting for a challenge to be extended. He strode up to the old man and demanded the rematch that he felt he was owed. Mr. Seg offered him a passive, neutral smile, then shrugged his shoulders and joined us at the table. The rest of us took a few steps back, having just replaced the real set with the trick one, and trying not to look too obviously giddy about it. The bottle caps were laid out between them. Even from a glance, I could already tell that the 4 marked ones from the rest. 3 of them were lightly scratched in different places, while the 4th had parts of its logo smeared. We tried to make the imperfections look as benign and accidental as possible. As per the rules, both players took turns shuffling the order before selecting their caps. Cooper waited for his venerable opponent to pick first. I could tell that the old man had 3 10s and a 15. In response, Cooper quickly snatched the remaining 15s and 1 10. Both checked their caps, or pretended to in the case of one of them. The game was officially underway. Cooper was the first to guess. 25, he smugly proclaimed. Despite it being wrong, he had likely figured out that winning on his first turn might have been a bit too suspicious. The man checked his score and shook his head, all the while maintaining his calm smile. Higher, he replied. His voice was so weak and raspy that it sounded like he was constantly struggling for air. It was his turn to guess. How about 70? Cooper made a clicking noise with his tongue, leaned back, and gave him the thumbs down. The whole game only lasted 3 rounds. Mr. Seg came dangerously close to hitting his mark on both his subsequent attempts, forcing Cooper to just pull the trigger and get it over with. 45. And just like that, it was over. I couldn't believe it. The plan actually worked. Cooper shot me a sly glance, his grin wider than ever, which I couldn't help but reciprocate. He extended his hand towards the dumbstruck man standing across from him, expecting his due reward. We were all taken aback as the man's sullen grimace suddenly turned to laughter. He cackled, wheezed, and then cackled some more. I'm not sure what sort of reaction we expected, but it certainly wasn't that. Before a now confused Cooper had the chance to retract his hand, Mr. Seg had grabbed it with both of his. He shook the boy's entire arm and then triumphantly slapped the coveted 50 note down in front of him. I had never seen the old man this lively before. He seemed genuinely overjoyed to have lost, as though a tremendous weight had been lifted off his shoulders. We looked on in stunned silence as he made his way over to the nearby intersection, laughing and cheering all the while. It was surreal watching him just stand there, tapping his feet against the pavement in celebratory fashion as the other pedestrians circled past him. He appeared to be waiting for something. Cars slowed down, thinking he intended on crossing, but the scraggly old guy just waved them off with a smile. "Think we broke 'em, boys?" Cooper said in a self-satisfied tone, and then proceeded to wave his prize in each of our faces. I should have known better than to expect my contribution to be acknowledged. All of a sudden, Mr. Seg spun around theatrically. Our eyes locked. He smirked, gave a bow, and, to our absolute horror, jumped backwards in front of an oncoming truck. The driver had no time to react. The initial collision sent the ragged man tumbling down beneath the wheels, where his body was effortlessly crushed under the massive vehicle's weight. There was a crunch followed by a wet, squelching noise that caused me to look away. All around me, there were screams of panic and confusion. "Ambulance! Somebody call an ambulance!" a woman yelled. It was clearly much too late for that, though. The rest of the kids were quick to scatter. I felt Cooper grab me by the elbow and try to pull me back, but my body wouldn't move. It was like my soles were nailed to the ground. After a few attempts, he gave up and sprinted off as well. To this day, I'm not sure what compelled me to stay. Maybe it was shock, or perhaps it was a feeling of guilt. Whatever the case, step by timid step, I inched forth towards the scene of the crash. Childishly, a part of me still held out hope that it was going to turn out okay in the end. Such hopes were promptly dashed as soon as I squeezed through the crowd of concerned and morbidly curious adults that had gathered around the victim. Splattered against the tarmac was an unrecognizable pile of meat. The limbs that were still attached were bent in angles too painful to describe. There were bones protruding through the man's oversized sweater. I didn't even want to imagine what his body looked like underneath. His waist and stomach region were completely flattened, separating him in two. All that was left behind was a smear of entrails stretching up the road. His head was the only part of him that had somehow remained relatively intact. His face was turned towards the sky, expression eerie and void of emotion. Suddenly his lips began to move. "Please, let me go. Please let me go," he repeated, chanting it over and over like a mantra. The fact that he was still alive at all was a miracle. Although from the miserable sod's perspective, it was clearly anything but. My stomach turned as the man's bulging, bloodshot eyes singled me out of the other bystanders. A warm trail of urine ran down my leg. His grimace twisted with anger. "You," he hissed through broken teeth. "You cheater. What have you done? She won't let me go. She'll never let me go because of you." The horrified crowd turned to look down at me. It was too much. I let out a scream and shoved past them, running away as fast as my short legs could carry me. I never told anybody about what happened that day, not even my parents. It sort of remained this unspoken secret that everyone involved knew not to talk about. Ironically, the whole experience might have done the majority of us good since we'd quit playing caps and started attending classes again. Or, at least, that might have been the case if my story ended there. Years went by. I was a few days removed from my 17th birthday. It was Sunday, and I had the apartment to myself for once, which didn't happen very often. I was planning on spending the evening eating crisps and watching the most raunchy, rubbish TV show I could find when, suddenly, the phone rang. With nobody else around, I begrudgingly rolled off the sofa and sauntered over to pick it up. It was Cooper. It took me a minute to recognize his voice. We hadn't spoken in over 3 years, not for any particular reason. We just grew apart. Although he tried to maintain a friendly tone at first, it was clear that there was more brimming beneath the surface. It didn't take long for the desperation to leak through. His voice cracked, and I could practically hear him holding back tears. He started telling me how sorry he was, and that he had no other choice. I did my best to encourage him to be less vague, but it made no difference. He just kept on apologizing. I decided to just wait for him to calm down before trying to make sense of his babbling. "Listen," he finally said. "You're at your place, right? Go check if your door and windows are locked and call the cops. Tell them that somebody's trying to break in or something. Just trust me, please." I made an effort to extract more information, but my concerns remained unacknowledged. He kept insisting that I wouldn't believe him, and that telling me would only make me think that he was playing a prank on me. He asked if my folks were around. I said no. "Oh no. Okay. Panic was starting to set in again. "Okay, I'll call the cops for you. Just make sure everything's locked tight and find a place to hide. Or, you know what? Better yet, go over to your neighbor's. But do it fast. You don't want to be trapped outside when he gets there. Go. Now." And just like that, he hung up. I slowly placed the handset down, shutting off all the lights, and walked up to the nearest window. It was pitch black outside. Droplets of rain trickled down the glass. Perhaps Cooper's insistence on remaining vague had been the right call, since it made me take the threat away more seriously than I likely would have otherwise. I paced back and forth, considering my options. I lived on the first floor, so, well, unlikely, it was definitely possible for someone to break a window and climb in if they wanted to. I glanced down the cramped entrance hall. Our upstairs neighbors were a kindly older couple that would have invited me in without question, especially after explaining the situation to them. Screw it, I thought. I had watched enough horror movies to know what happens to that one skeptic guy who insists on ignoring all the warning signs until it's too late. I grabbed the keys off the table and headed for the door. Unfortunately, that was about as far as I got. Smarter men than me have debated just how far you can pervert the human form until it is no longer considered human. I'm not exactly qualified to determine where the line needs to be drawn, but there is one thing that I do know for certain. The thing standing on the other side of that threshold, bathed in the harsh light of the staircase corridor, was definitely not human. At least, not anymore. Its calcified hand shot forth and slapped against the insides of the door before I had the chance to slam it shut. I jolted back. Blocking my only conventional means of escape was this misshapen husk of a figure. It was naked apart from the grimy overcoat draped over its frame, the front of which hung open to reveal shriveled, almost mummified-looking flesh. Its body was held together by copper wire, and there were pieces of rebar connecting its upper torso to its pelvis. I had no idea how it still had use of its legs, considering that the metal bars were the only thing linking them to the rest of its skeleton. But as undeniably grotesque as the fusion of bone, gray flesh, and rusted metal was, it was its face that caused my chest to tighten. It wore a face that I instantly recognized despite its atrophied state. "Mr. Seg? Is that you?" The old man, or at least what was left of him, didn't say anything. Not at first. He only smiled, dry lips cracking as he did so. Just then did I notice that he was dragging some sort of tool behind. As his feet shuffled past the welcome mat, I saw it more clearly. He was wielding a crowbar. "Your little friend told me where to find you. He told me everything." His voice was even weaker than I remembered, now barely above a whisper. "He told me how the whole thing was your idea from the start." When I tried to protest, he struck the wall with his improvised weapon, chipping it and causing me to cower in fear. I considered screaming for help, but I had a feeling that he would have taken even less kindly to that. "Sit," he demanded. I swallowed the lump in my throat, lowering myself onto the living room carpet. Mr. Seg nodded and gently closed the front door behind himself. We were drenched in darkness. The sole source of light was the TV, which still droned on in the background. As terrifying as the man's appearance was, only being able to make out his crooked outline was arguably even worse. The walking cadaver stood by the entrance hall for a good while before finally shambling towards me. Each labored step sent chills running down my spine. My mind cycled through different and progressively bleaker scenarios. His joints made a disgusting pop as he knelt down directly in front of me. My nose burned, assaulted by the stench of mold and decay. One half of his ghastly face became illuminated by the bluish light emanating from the TV, whereas the rest of him remained shrouded. He then reached into his pockets, producing bottle cap after bottle cap and placing them down between us. Is that what this is all about? Look, I'm sorry. We were just kids. We didn't know any better." The gaunt man shook his head. He cared little for my excuses. After having arranged all 20 caps, he pulled back and waited for me to shuffle them. It's not like I had much of a choice. The ultimatum was clear. Win, and presumably get to live. Lose or refuse to play and get your brains bashed in by an undead crowbar-wielding maniac. The rancid abomination sitting across from me, and I, both selected our 4 caps and then discreetly confirmed our scores. My ears pulsated in tandem with the thumping in my chest. I had pulled a 10, a 20, and 2 25s, meaning that my total score was 80. Round numbers are generally not considered ideal since they are easiest to guess. I was already off to a bad start. Mr. Seg took the liberty of going first. 50. A predictable choice. Not too close, but not as far off as I would have liked. Now it was up to me to decide whether it was worth steering him away from the mark. Higher, I confessed after a few agonizing seconds of deliberation. He nodded. It was my turn. I didn't know where to start, so I just went with 50 as well. Lower, he murmured. To my knowledge, nobody had ever beaten him fair and square. I very much doubted that I was going to be the first. The goal was to survive long enough to come up with some sort of escape plan. 60 was his subsequent guess. Higher, I replied with even less confidence than before. I should have lied, but for some reason I was once again finding myself unable to. It was my turn again. 30. There wasn't a single feature of his that I could reliably read. It was like playing against a statue. Lower. If he was being truthful, then my only remaining choices were 20, which is the lowest possible score one can have, and 25, assuming, of course, that he hadn't been leading me astray from the start. 70. I was pushed against a corner. How was I expected to keep a straight face with the pale mask of death staring literally right at me? His next turn would have almost certainly been my last if I didn't think of a way to stall him. I could have pretended like he was wrong, but there was this lingering feeling in my gut that he would have known regardless, if I was willing to admit it right away or not. Suddenly I recalled something. A detail that I've been clinging on to ever since what happened at that intersection. I doubted that bringing it up was going to make a difference, but it was worth a shot. Especially if it brought me some time. Who is she? I saw him tense up despite the timidness of my inquiry. Noticing his reaction, I pressed the matter further, this time with a marginally more empathetic pitch to my tone. Back then, you said that she won't let you go. What does that mean? Mr. Seg looked down at the unfortunate state of his body. He ran a finger along the wires that bound its shriveled tissue together. There was a deep sense of regret and melancholy reflected in his sunken eyes. I was a boy, about the same age as you when we first met. I was tired of always losing. He paused after every sentence, as if expecting some malevolent force to strike him down. When nothing happened, he carried on. Always the loser, never the winner. He chuckled dryly, but then she came to me. He leaned in, cupping one side of his mouth while his clouded pupils darted warily about. His breath caused bile to rise to the back of my throat. I felt compelled to also check my surroundings, but saw nothing in the darkness that encompassed us. Then my eyes fell upon the crowbar that lay across his lap unattended. My palm began to itch. Lady Luck, he whispered. She offered me a deal and I took it. Now she won't let me go until... Knowing that I was unlikely to get another opening, I reached forth, snatched the steel bar and dug its bent claw into the side of the corpse's neck. It was enough to knock him over. I crawled back until my shoulders hit a wall, and then slowly rose to my feet. There was no blood. It was like his skin was made of paper. Once the initial shock had subsided and I noticed him reaching for the tool embedded in his neck, I grabbed one of Mom's decorative pots from the counter and smashed it against his skull before running for the door. I stumbled down the single flight of stairs and, to my surprise and great relief, found 2 officers waiting for me at the bottom. All 3 of us heard the sound of glass shattering. When the cops went up to investigate, they only found a broken window. They searched the alleyways and then the whole block, but predictably, discovered nobody matching my intruder's description. Of course, I spared them the more unbelievable parts of my account. They would have probably assumed that I was high if I told them that some Frankenstein's monster-looking thing had broken into my home and forced me to play caps with him. I never heard from Cooper again. He was the one who rang the cops, so I can only presume that they had some questions for him as well. If they did, I was never informed of the outcome. He had moved several times since we lost contact, so I had no idea where to find him. For all I know, Mr. Seg could have gone back and finished the job. Though I doubt that. If he wanted to just straight up kill either of us, he would have done it. In fact, I don't think he was ever the real villain to begin with. He was but a symptom of something far more malevolent that's still out there, preying on the unsuspecting and gullible among us. It's been over 2 decades. I've been through a divorce, married again, and had 2 kids that are currently in their preteens. This is the first time I'm telling my story exactly how it happened. Why am I bringing it up now, you ask? It was my turn to drive the kids to school this morning. My daughter had forgotten her backpack, so I went up to her room to fetch it. When I picked it up off the floor, however, I felt something jiggle in one of the side pockets. The sound was all too familiar. I looked inside. What I found were exactly 20 bottle caps, each with a number written on the inside of it. I think we'll need to have a talk. I live in a rural farming community. Almost everything is surrounded by large cornfields. Now, I've heard my fair share of rumors and myths regarding the fields, but I'm not particularly superstitious. Or at least, I wasn't. I was driving back home after taking my daughter, Salem, to a doctor's appointment. She's only 4 months old, so we still have to go to checkups for her. It's the time of year when the corn stalks are taller than my car. When it's lights out, I do really enjoy the drive. It's calming and beautiful. It was dark out though, and the stalks looked like they were reaching for my car. There's kind of a rule here that when it's dark out, you shouldn't look into the corn. I don't know why that's a rule, but I followed it to a T that night. My stomach was in knots as I kept my eyes firmly on the road ahead of me. Salem began crying. That's normal for her. She's a fussy baby, and she is not a big fan of the car. I dug through her bag in the seat next to me for her favorite toy. A little stuffed Mothman that my sister got her for a joke. With a name like Salem, she regularly gets stuff like that. I reached back to drop the toy into her car seat. As I did so, my head turned towards the fields. For just a split second, I saw eyes. I immediately turned my attention back to the road. My heart was pounding, but I was trying to be rational. The eyes had flashed, like a cat, but entirely too big. I swallowed down my fear. I was being rational. It was definitely a cat and nothing more. Salem stopped crying. She actually started laughing. No one has ever made her laugh before, neither me nor her mother. I looked in the rear-view mirror and found those eyes looking back at me again. There's a second part to that rule. If you do look into the corn, don't look in the back seat. I ignored that rule. My daughter was in danger. It didn't matter that she was laughing. Even poison can look like precious fruits sometimes. I slammed on the brakes and whipped around. There was nothing there. Salem went back to her forlorn crying. I breathed a sigh of relief, then looked around. There was nothing. I continued on down the road. Salem's little screams were a blessing. It meant she was safe. I glanced up into the rearview mirror to check on her. There were those eyes. I had no time to react before calloused, long fingers were around my neck. I blacked out. When I awoke, it was bright out. I was still in the car, in a ditch on the side of the road. Police and ambulance surrounded the vehicle. My ears were ringing. Someone was trying to help me out of the vehicle. When I got out, I saw a man holding Salem's car seat. His eyes flashed. The eyes from the night prior. Salem was laughing. I snatched my baby away from him, pulling her from the car seat so I could hold her to my chest. She immediately began sobbing. When I looked up from her, the man was gone. But when I looked into the fields, they didn't seem too empty. The air was alive with the sound of chatter. Cutlery and glasses clinked against the worn wooden tables, and the smell of cuisines from across the world mingled and danced under my nose. A handful of servers weaved between the tightly packed tables, carrying dishes of every color and flavor, deftly navigating the throngs of customers entirely too wrapped up in their own conversations to make room. That was how I found myself on that brisk Saturday evening, standing by the door to the kitchen, surveying my domain. Business was good as usual, and it seemed the steady stream of custom wasn't letting up. I offered an encouraging smile to Emily, one of our junior servers, as she burst out the door with 2 bowls of curry on one arm and a plate of rabanada on the other. She wearily returned the gesture. Suddenly from around the corner to the main entrance came Jack, 19 years old and our newest recruit. I'd placed him at the front desk, taking reservations and greeting guests until he got a lay of the land. My instructions were clear. He was only to leave his post for his allotted break, which wouldn't be for another 90 minutes. Or if... "One of your special clients is here, sir," he whispered breathlessly, eyeing the nearest table to make sure he wasn't being overheard. 2 generous servings of dong po pork, and what appeared to be the table's 3rd bottle of wine made the possibility unlikely. He continued, "The gentleman says his name is Mr. Miller, and he'd like to see you." I smiled. Ashton Miller is discreet and tips generously. He's always welcome. "Excellent. Send him this way," I replied briskly, and he nodded, turning back to the entrance. "And Jack?" He turned his head back. "I appreciate your discretion, as you'll see in the month's pay." Jack nodded again, this time with a smile, and disappeared around the corner. Ashton Miller, a lean, gangly man in a thick overcoat, staggered into the restaurant proper a few moments later. His springy curls were hidden behind a blue bobble hat, and much of his lower face behind a woolen scarf. He's clearly stolen the 2 from different people because they went together horribly. A simple face mask and a high collar, and all that was visible of the man were a pair of beady eyes which darted about before landing on me. He stiffened up and strode over. "Evening, friend," he murmured. Each word came labored from Ashton, monotone and with a resonant after-sound like his throat were a great bell. Compared to my more gabby customers, he was a welcome change. "Good evening, Mr. Miller. Shall we?" I gestured to a door marked "Manager Only" down the other side of the room, and Ashton eagerly nodded, the pom-pom on his hat bouncing ridiculously. On the other side of the door was my office, a simple but respectable affair with a rich oak desk, a row of cheap filing cabinets on one wall, and a bookcase on the other. I reached behind the bookcase and flicked a switch, and the whole thing swung out, the entrance to a spiral staircase in its place. Back during the Prohibition era, this place had been a speakeasy. Luckily for my purposes, the whole restaurant had shut down in 1923, so the unregistered basement remained a secret. Now only I and my clientele have any clue of its existence. Ashton had to duck a little to fit down the staircase, the top of his hat still scraping against the top. As we neared the bottom, a warm orange glow could be seen from the room beyond, and at last, we stepped out into the bar. A series of small candlelit chandeliers lit the length of the room, along one side of which ran the bar itself. Rows upon rows of little corked bottles sat on shelves behind the bar, all adorned with handwritten labels. The labels were in a code only I knew, which meant that nobody but I could tell which drink would give you the best buzz of your life, and which would burn a hole through your esophagus. It helps to discourage theft in a world where the police getting involved isn't an option. A shoddily shaved man with a wide-brimmed hat sat slumped on one of the bar stools, surrounded by a half-dozen empty shot glasses, all of them emitting small wisps of smoke. With one hand, the man was holding a glass over his outstretched tongue, hoping to catch a non-existent last drop of drink. With another, he drummed the top of the bar, as if impatiently waiting for something. With a third, he adjusted the brim of his hat, while the rest danced around his jacket, feeling at various pockets. His droopy form immediately snapped upright as I entered, and a Cheshire cat grin spread impossibly wide across his face. Hey boss," he called in a reedy, East London accent. His arms all sprung forward, lifting him off the bar and dropping him to the floor, from which he bounced to his feet to face us. I shivered involuntarily at the uncanny sight. "And Ashton, it's been too long, my friend. How are you keeping?" Ashton stared impassively in response. The man nodded for a few moments, encouraging Ashton to speak, but eventually gave up. "So, boss, here's the thing, yeah? I'm fresh out at the minute, but you get me one last drink for the night, and I'll pay my tab first thing in the morning. What do you say?" "I say you're done for the night, Skint," I said, eyeing the empty glasses as an excuse not to meet the eyes of the spindly giant. "You want more? You come back tomorrow." I prayed my fear wasn't audible. My clients are usually smart enough not to bite the hand that feeds them, but the fact that Skint could tear my limbs from my body as easily as rip the wings off a butterfly was impossible to ignore at moments like this. Skint didn't react for a moment, then two of his arms jerked towards me. His fingers flared with razor-sharp nails. My heart leapt to my throat, and I stumbled back, but each arm was quickly restrained by two more before it could reach me. Skint laughed nervously. "Sorry about them, boss. They get awfully rowdy without their drink." He paused for a moment, smiling desperately at me, then relented. "Right, yep. You got it, boss. I'll be back tomorrow." All but two of Skint's arms retracted into his jacket, and, tipping his hat as he passed us, he headed upstairs, muttering to himself, "Tomorrow, tomorrow." "Apologies, Mr. Miller," I said, composing myself as we made for the wall opposite the bar, where a couple of booths were hidden from the main area by a set of curtains. Ashton sat at the table, then wheezed. My usual, please. I nodded and stepped back from the booth, drawing the curtain back into place. Ashton likes his privacy, especially while eating. I walked behind the bar and to the door of the walk-in freezer. In its speakeasy days, the room had been a mere larder, but now a refrigeration unit chugged quietly in the corner, and frost covered the walls. Various carcasses hung from hooks in the ceiling, and I quickly selected one. For most clients, a specific cut was desired. Ashton was anything but picky, however, and with a cleaver I took from a rack on the wall, I severed a whole leg. The carcass was returned to the hook, and I took the leg with me. On the way back to Ashton, I chose a bottle from the shelf behind the bar. On its label was a semicircle bisected by a straight horizontal line, followed by a triangle. Perfect. I returned to the booth and passed the leg and the bottle to Ashton through the curtain. We sometimes talked as he ate, something with which I hoped his drink would help him. But this time he said something he'd never said before. A break from routine was something most unusual to Ashton, so I took notice. Would you sit with me? He croaked from behind the curtain. I felt my composure drop a little, but it quickly returned. Of course, Mr. Miller, if that's what you'd like. I ducked behind the curtain and sat opposite Ashton, who had removed his hat and scarf and was in the middle of taking off his mask. A shot of ice went through my blood as his face was revealed, and I had to force myself to maintain eye contact. His mandibles clicked together in anticipation of his meal, and he uncorked the bottle and took a swig. With a sickening series of snaps and crunches, Ashton's chitinous thorax receded as the drink graced his throat, and at last, an unlabored breath came to him. Thank you, Ashton said with a relieved sigh. That's much better. He took the leg from the table and, beginning at the thigh, brought his mandibles down upon it. He cut through the flesh like warm butter, finally stopping as he hit the bone. His jaws snapped together again and again on the stump of bone, wearing it away rather than breaking it. At last, the bone was weakened enough that Ashton snapped off the stump, silently crunching away at it for a few moments until it disappeared down his gullet. He then proceeded a little further down the leg and continued. My throat burned with bile at the sight, but I managed to keep myself together, if a few shades paler than before. Things have been rough out there. He spoke between bites. Lots been going on. I must confess I've been out of the loop, I replied, trying to maintain my light tone. Aside from Skint and yourself, I haven't had any customers down here for a month now. This fact had been a source of concern as of late, but my clients aren't exactly the reliable sort, so I'd assume this unusually long slump was just a passing phase. Ashton nodded. Well, that'll be why. People scared to be seen congregating. Rat trappers been getting folks nervous. If I'd been behind the curtain, I would have rolled my eyes despite myself. Operation Rat Trap has been running for over 30 years, and the most success I'd heard of them having was taking out Herbert Briggs in '02. Briggs was one of Skint's drinking buddies, and the most reckless, idiotic man I'd ever met. In fact, I half suspect his liver got to him first, and the trappers only took the credit after the fact. In short, if that was the best they could do, I could afford to pay the rat trappers little mind. Ashton must have noticed my reaction. Yeah, I understand. The trappers getting people nervous. I'd be skeptical too. But they aren't some underfunded band of Secret Service wannabes anymore. Seems someone in high places is taking an interest in their work, believing we might be real. They've been stepping up their work. A tingling of nerves went through me. For the first time about something outside the room, Ashton was reliable, not prone to fear. If he was worried about the trappers, they might really be becoming an issue. I tried to compose myself. While I wouldn't worry too much, I said with what I hoped was confidence, if the trappers get too bold, Dalton will sort them out. Remember in '08 when they stumbled across one of his places? 3 dead agents and no leads. That scared them off for a while. Ashton, who had now reached the lower tibia, leaned back in his seat, cocking his head to the side sympathetically. I'm sorry to tell you this, friend, but Dalton's dead. They got him. Ashton's words hit me like cannonballs. Dalton? Dead? Impossible. I remembered the crack in the far side of the bar where he'd once thrown Briggs for taking a sip from his drink. His arms had bulged to the size of tree trunks, and if Briggs hadn't stretched his neck a couple of meters free of the bar, he might have killed him there and then. As it was, he'd broken 4 ribs, and had walked with a limp every time I'd seen him. Someone like Dalton couldn't just die. Not to a bunch of amateurs playing detective. Dalton? I managed to choke out, completely abandoning my professional demeanor. Are you sure? Ashton nodded. Clark and Jobs, too, he said wistfully. As I said, people are getting scared. Ashton finished his meal, sliding the last of the foot into his mouth. He paused for a moment, then began hacking, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. At last, he choked up 5 half-dissolved toenails onto the table. Apologies, my friend. They never quite agreed with me. Ashton sighed, satisfied. Delicious as ever. I will certainly be coming back, no matter what the others say. Pay them no mind, Mr. Miller, I said, my professionalism slowly returning. Even if the rat trappers are getting bolder, you'll always be safe here. I'll make sure of it. That I am sure of. Ashton choked out, the rigidity slowly returning to his throat. Seems time to leave. Ashton donned his mask, hat, and scarf, and I joined him back up the stairs. He slipped me a check as we walked. It would cover the next 2 months of the lease on the restaurant. I thanked him for his generosity, which he brushed off. Price worth the service, he said. I couldn't quite tell under the mask, but he might have been smiling. I bid Ashton farewell and was left alone to once again survey the restaurant from my vantage point near the kitchen door. The atmosphere was as alive as ever, but tainted ever so much by Ashton's revelation. Did my clients really think my restaurant was no longer safe for them? Was all my preparation and care not enough for them? Might it not be enough? I dismissed the thought. This place was my home. It was my livelihood. More than that, it was their sanctuary. I wasn't going to let them take it away. That brings us to the present. This has been a message to the rat trappers. I know you comb the internet for mention of my clients, so this will no doubt make it to you. I know you won't be able to ignore a confession, much less a challenge, for that's what this is. You may have won some early victories, but these people have been hunted since the dawn of humanity, and have hunted you right back more than effectively. And they have me. I will continue to post about my experiences, to show my clientele they have nothing to fear, to which you have two possible responses. You may step back. You may retreat back to the light, where monsters don't exist and where people just go missing. Or you can stay. You can try to stop me. You can come looking for a war. And you'll find one. This happened to me about 2 years ago, around late December of 2020. I was 19 around the time. Me and my girlfriend were at my grandparents' place having a couple drinks out in the garage until it got too cold to stay out there. It was one of the coldest nights of the year, and there was a bad blizzard that night. We live in Canada, by the way. We both went back to the house around 2 a.m. She went into my room, and I went out in the kitchen to cook something for us in the oven. I was on my phone standing alone out in the kitchen when my grandma and my girlfriend both walked out the kitchen together. It was a bit strange because my grandma is never up that late, and it was even stranger that my girlfriend came out at the same time. The first thing my grandma said to me is, "Don't go back out there tonight. On a night like this, people lose their lives." I was a little bit freaked out because I was just about to head back out to the garage to grab something. I never told anyone I was going back out. My girlfriend and my grandma just stood there staring at me with the weirdest expressions I've ever seen. With very unnatural smiles that didn't seem right. My girlfriend then walked over and gave me a hug. When I grabbed her, she was ice cold. I commented about this, and when I mentioned how cold she was, her expression changed. Her smile faded, and she looked up at me with really serious, sad eyes and didn't say anything. There was something else I noticed too. She smelled like a campfire, an earthy, smoky smell. There wasn't an explanation for this, and she didn't smell like that earlier. I swear at that moment, I got chills all over. There was something so off about it all, but I couldn't put my finger on it. My girlfriend whispered in my ear, "Don't go outside tonight." She walked back over to my grandma. She stood beside her with her head down and a serious expression while my grandma was still staring at me with that weird, fake smile. It was so bizarre, I just stood there speechless. The wind began to literally howl outside. My grandma turned and looked at my girlfriend. "Don't mess with black magic," she said. "Nothing good is gonna come from it." My girlfriend didn't say anything. She continued looking down. I stood there confused. My girlfriend looked up at me. "We have to go now," she said. They both started walking away. My grandma looked back at me for a second. "See you on the flip side," she said with that weird smile. I got another chill through my whole body when she said that. They turned the corner and left the kitchen. I stood there for a while. I didn't know what to make of it all. I decided not to go out to the garage. I'd go out and get my stuff the next morning. I stayed out in the kitchen for another 10 minutes until the food was done. I went back into my room with it. My girlfriend was in bed laying down. She got up and we put on a movie. I guess I was quiet because she asked me what's wrong. I told her everything was okay. It took me 10 minutes to say something about it because, to be honest, I was still frightened by it. I turned to her and asked her why she and my grandma came out to the kitchen. The second I said that, my nose started bleeding. I ran to the bathroom and got something to stop the bleeding. When I went back in the room, I told my girlfriend everything. As you can guess, she said she never went out into the kitchen, and she swore on someone's life she was in the room the whole time. She also didn't smell like smoke anymore. We went and woke up my grandma right after, and my grandma said the same thing. She actually thought we were trying to mess with her, and she didn't believe me. We were so freaked out after this, we had trouble sleeping for the rest of the night. The part that really messed my girlfriend up was when I told her about how cold she felt and how she smelled like smoke. The only explanation we could come up with was that maybe if I went outside that night, something bad would have happened to me. Maybe the spirits of dead relatives watching over me came to me in that form so I wouldn't be scared, and they could get the message through. The last part of it that made sense was the part about the black magic. My girlfriend just got a book about witchcraft from her friend the week prior. My girlfriend never opened the book again after this. She took what was said as a warning. I've been thinking about writing this story down for the past 2 years, and my girlfriend encouraged me to finally do it, because maybe someone else out there had an experience like this. To this day, I still get chills thinking about it, especially the last thing said. See you on the flip side. I'm a student at a university in the UK, and have been for 2 years now. Last year and this year, I have been living in student halls, which for anyone who isn't familiar with the term, is student accommodation. During my first year, I was on the second floor of the block of flats I was living in, and never experienced anything weird. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that freaked me out. However, now in my second year, I'm in a different block of flats, and this time I'm on the third floor. The highest floor in the block, with only another floor above for storage rooms. No one lived up there, which is important to note. The only people that go up to the fourth floor are maintenance and cleaning during the hours of 7 a.m. and 5 p.m. When me and my friends first moved into this flat, we noticed that we could hear weird noises above at night when we were going to bed. Sounds like chairs being scraped across the floor, or just furniture in general being moved, as well as what sounded like people running up and down the corridor. Loud and heavy steps. Didn't think much of it at first, as we didn't actually realize the fourth floor didn't have people above us. Before I get into the details properly, a little timeline is that we moved in September 2022. Started hearing noises a couple of weeks after we moved in, and then it was the middle of October, so quite a few weeks later, that I was woken up in the middle of the night, 2:45 to 3 a.m., to what I can only describe as the sound of something large, with a bit of weight to it, being thrown across the floor above me. It startled me as it jumped me awake. That's the first time I felt a bit creeped out by it, as I wondered what on earth people were doing in the flat above us at that time. Not only had it woken me up that night, but it had woken my friend up too, who had come through to ask if anyone had heard the noise. The next day, we contacted our head resident of the block and asked if she would have a word with the people above us to keep the noise down during the night, as we like to have a good time as much as anyone, but not at 3 in the morning, especially when we have full days of classes the next day. This was when she informed us that there wasn't actually anyone in the flats above us, and that it was all storage rooms and a cleaning cupboard. This information clearly freaked us out, as the noises we were hearing obviously shouldn't be coming from a storage cupboard. From this point, we didn't really know what to do, so we just had to kind of get on with it. By weird coincidence, the next week we required maintenance to come out and have a look at our fridge, which had stopped working, and we asked him if they happened to go to the storage in the middle of the night, or security, as we had been hearing noises in the middle of the night, but they were adamant that no one was going up there past 5 to 5:30 at night. But he was happy to go up and have a look to see if there was a trapped bird or something, which would be making all the noise. 30 minutes later, He reported back that there was nothing, but one of the big storage shelves had collapsed, so that could have been what we heard. We got some comfort from that and moved on. After that, we didn't hear the noise for a while, until the middle of November when it started back up again. This time, it was more obnoxious. Things being thrown, scraping, running, banging on things, dropping heavy objects on the floor, so it sounded like a person was about to fall through our ceiling. It was more annoying than creepy at this point. We then decided that going up to the 4th floor to see for ourselves would be a beneficial option. We got up there, and it looked just the same as our floor, except there was just locked doors. We couldn't get into any of them, and that was that. There was nothing there that could have answered any of our questions, so we got back into the lift to go back down to our floor, but as we were leaving it, we heard a sound coming from one of the locked rooms. It was like a scratching noise when your dog is scratching the door to get out, or dragging your nails down a hard surface. We stopped to listen, but the scratching got harsher, so we took our leave. We have seen horror movies, and we aren't stupid. We reported the noises to the accommodation staff, and they checked it out. Came back with nothing once again. We came to the conclusion after that we weren't going to get answers, so we left it once again, and just had to deal with the noises we were hearing. Now we are at the start of December, and it's getting worse, which is why I've come here. The noises have gotten worse, but me, as well as all my friends, have admitted to hearing scratching noises coming from our hallway in the middle of the night. We all lock the doors at night, so it would be impossible for anyone to be getting in the flat. At first we thought one of us was just winding each other up and trying to freak us out, but after we have all admitted to hearing the noise, we have now realized that it isn't one of us. A couple of days ago, we all stayed up in my room to see if we could hear the noise and prove it wasn't one of us making the noise, and sure enough, around 2 to 3 a.m. we heard the scratching. At first it was distant, like it was at the front door, and then got louder as if someone was dragging their nails along the wall, and it stopped right outside of my room. It's safe to say we were all freaked out, and called security, who came up and found nothing except me and my friends clutching each other. It happens every night now, and we don't know what to do. We don't know what it is, and clearly no one else is experiencing this either. We are desperate for some advice to what's going on, and although none of us are saying it, but if whatever is doing this can make its way into our locked and secure flat, then surely it will be able to make its way into our locked and secure bedrooms too. Any advice would be helpful. I can still remember what life used to be like. It's crazy to make that statement about something that transpired a little under a year ago, as though it happened in a bygone era of the past. The reality, though, is that nothing is the same. Nothing. The story that's been passed along through those of us that remain is that it all started in the state of Georgia last fall. It seems that a young man in his 20s was deer hunting on his family farm when he witnessed a large antlered buck stand and walk on 2 legs for just a few moments, as though he was a humanoid before resetting back to 4 legs and carrying on with chasing does. He even claimed that the entire muscle structure of the deer had changed, but he also reasoned that all the beers from the night before might have altered his coherency. Nonetheless, that didn't stop him from pulling the trigger on his grandpa's old .264 Win Mag and dropping the animal in its tracks from 150 yards away. Everything appeared to be business as usual for the young hunter, as he proceeded to load the buck into his Chevy pickup and haul it back to the family barn to hang for a few days to allow the meat to age and tenderize. Normally a hunter would have gutted the deer in the field, but this young man reasoned that he'd just take care of that once it was hoisted up high in the barn. No sooner had he accomplished getting the deer hung, and winched before he grabbed his weathered pocket knife and proceeded to make the first incision into the buck's abdomen. What occurred at that moment is what would change life as we know it. You see, as soon as that blade pierced hide, the antlers to the buck began to sprawl out longer and longer, until finally they formed a 4-digit appendage. Next thing the young man knew, his own knife was drawn across his neck, and he fell to the ground gasping for air as his jugular had been severed. The father of this young man rounded the corner just in time to see the being standing on 2 legs over his struggling son. He had just enough time to grab his own lever-action rifle propped up against the doorway and cycle a shell into the chamber before it turned around to face him. In what seemed like a mirage, the being hazily transformed into the very likeness of his son. Being obviously conflicted, he found himself unable to pull the trigger as he aimed on its chest. The scenario became even more bizarre when from under scalp of this human-like being began to sprout antlers. Not just spikes, a full 5x5 rack. The farmer snapped out of it just in time to begin pulling the trigger again, but the humanoid took notice and was immediately on him, goring his torso with its rack. Supposing the old man to be dead, the being proceeded to waltz out of the barn and into the house where it murdered his wife. As best as anyone can configure from this entire situation, these beings have the ability to communicate worldwide. The reasoning behind this hypothesis is that they overtook the entire world that very night. And by they, I mean the deer. Not just one variety or subspecies of deer, by the way. All of the antlered creatures of the planet, the elk, moose, stags, mule deer, blacktail, whitetail, fallow, axis, and so on and so on. They marched the neighborhoods of mankind that night and proceeded to slaughter every human they came across and steal their physical identity, with a set of antlers being added to the new look. I was only spared that evening because my, honestly, quite privileged family was flying on a private jet that evening. The news caught us just in time to keep us from landing at our runway in Los Angeles. My father directed the pilot to take us to our family's private island in the Pacific. My dad's theory was that, given the lack of wildlife on the island, we'd be safe. His theory proved wrong. As we sat in the great room with my grandfather's and great-grandfather's trophy game heads on the wall and watched the live stream on the news, I heard a ripping sound. Before I had time to react, a seemingly malleable appendage burst through my father's chest, and then withdrew as it took on the outline of my father and, you guessed it, sprouted antlers. It was then that I noticed the game heads were all missing their antlers. The antlers were a living entity for all of these years, and had escaped the mounts. I won't bore you with the entirety of my trauma and survival of that evening. I'll simply tell you that I was the only member of 7 people, plus the pilot, that escaped the yacht that night and traversed into the wide open ocean. I eventually dared to anchor towards land 6 days later to retrieve supplies. I soon learned that, much like everyone figured deer behaved, these entities rest during the day. So then, the chance of sneaking through a town to retrieve non-perishable goods and fuel was better around noon. I only went when absolutely necessary, and took as much as I could at each excursion. You see, the sad reality is that the existing foods on the shelves out there will likely outlive me. What I found to be true was that they killed almost all of humanity that evening. The food is abundant. The fuel will eventually be a challenge, but with only a year having passed, that's not my first concern. Don't get me wrong, I've seen signs of other survivors in my travels up and down the West Coast, but I've never met anyone in person after that fateful night. It's the good old ham radios that have facilitated my human interactions. We are a small community worldwide of about 300, from what we've estimated, but we stay in constant connection and accountability with each other. We've managed to figure a few things out about our enemy. One of our survivors is an archaeologist, and he believes that these hooved species hadn't originated with antlers on their male counterparts. Ancient cave drawings depict deer as not having antlers going way back. This has given us the theory that the entity took residence in these creatures in the form of antlers atop their scalps ages ago. Of course, our most significant findings in this department was the ability to survive indefinitely so long as the antlers retain their structure. This is why game head mounts across the world killed many people in a seeming covert-like strike. It's as though they hoped they would be hunted and displayed as part of their plan. Their intelligence has proved tricky to decipher. In personal confrontations, we found them to be simply tyrannical in their ferocity and insanely quick in their reflexes, but not altogether cunning. I myself have narrowly escaped death a few times in my supply runs. I believe only because I dealt with individuals and not herds. That being said, their true strength lies in their communication with one another. It's an almost eerie, hive-like system in which they are receiving orders and acting in unison. This is how they manage to conquer the world, we believe. As far as killing them, we have found that gunshots aimed to shatter the antlers themselves, especially more at the base of the rack, do kill the being permanently. Before you get too excited though, we found that very rarely does a bullet strike its target given their reflexes, unless you manage to catch one resting, which they rest in herds, of course. You might think killing the host form first and then smashing the antlers would be plausible, but it's not. The reality is that they are now on the offense, so anyone who kills the host form soon finds themselves one of my radio pals, Alec from Australia. Claims he shattered one with a baseball bat, but who could prove or disprove that claim? To say the least, life is, well, not life anymore. I've lived in isolation for going on 372 days now. I've spent many moments pondering the very purpose of the struggle of it all, to just exist in general. But I came to a conclusion a couple of months ago, and it just might change everything. I would rather know that my life had some impact on the world, so I decided to declare war on them/it, whatever this is. It's funny how the fear of death being taken out of the equation can change literally everything. But, sure enough, that's what it took to get my creative juices flowing. I knew getting closer was never a safe option, so I had to think distance. I started to observe them, and I soon discovered that they still retained their herbivore tendencies, even in human form. They actually ate like animals in a very primitive and gluttonous way, as though it's their last meal with no caution to their surroundings. So, I began to poison their various food sources with anything I could find. Antifreeze, drain cleaners, it didn't matter. I just needed it to make them sick. Since they travel mostly in large herds, I was finding myself unloading boxes of ammo each day from large-scale rooftops at the antlers of herds that lay lethargic and despondent in the streets. The fascinating part of it all was that, just like a hive, a new member will appear to take the place of a missing position in the herd. You might think this depressing to feel like you aren't accomplishing anything when you return day by day to the same numbers. The merit of it all came together though when I found myself only picking off stragglers in the streets of Los Angeles and realizing that I had finally killed everything in the area. So, my journey took me all over the state, and within a month, I had refined my methods to the point that I cleared most of the large cities in California. Even better, though, was that my friend across the world started doing the same thing. We did lose a few of us in the worldwide battle, But in the last 2 months, we've accomplished taking back many of major cities in the world. In fact, some of my friends began to rendezvous in person and recolonize areas. They even began fortifying them. We found the safest method of surviving, though, was to remain out at sea a few miles in the evening until we were certain our newly reclaimed territories could be made impenetrable. I myself had been talking to a woman named Gabriella along the western coast of Mexico throughout this entire catastrophe, and we finally decided to meet in person and perhaps start something in our part of the world. We decided to meet along the coast today. It was near sunset when I caught sight of her boat. I climbed aboard and called for her with no answer to be heard. Fearing the worst, I entered the cabin and found her there. Her face marred beyond human recognition and her hands clutching a shotgun. There were empty shells littering the room and pellet holes all over the walls. That's when I heard a thud out on deck. As I peeked through the windows, my heart fell to my stomach. It was a whole flock of seagulls with antlers. I've barricaded and boarded up the cabin as best as I can, but I know my chances are not great at surviving this. I warned the others over the radio and told them that I thought underground might be the next best hope at saving our race. I had plans to attempt steering this rig towards shore and making a run for cover on land, but the splashes and bumps I felt earlier removed my ambition as I felt the boat begin to sink. You see, I just pried a board open and peeked over the balcony into the waters. As I write this, my boat is being bombarded on all sides by a school of dolphins, and they all have antlers. It was around 7 months ago when I first made my report to the higher-ups, many of whom immediately assumed I was lying. Some suggested it was for the sake of garnering attention, and others suggested that I was attempting to cause a panic within the community. Many had come to label me as a shit stirrer, but one of the higher-ups, Gary, a man who I had collaborated with previous projects, was the only one who had bothered to investigate the issue. "And only because it's you," he said. The meeting took place soon after. The television droned softly with the sound of static. The dim, grainy screen cast an odd, whirring incandescent across the room that sketched thick black shadows across the textured walls. The strange lighting created the impression of thick silhouettes that pulsed deeply within all the odd little crevices of the room. Gary sat motionless for 16 minutes before his eyes began to flicker. "Gary?" I said. "Are you in?" There was silence for a moment. "Yeah," he said lowly. "I'm in." Sure enough, there was that odd, disjointed quality to his voice that I had found myself looking for. Over the years, I had come to recognize this as a subtle but sure sign of success. That strange, almost asynchronous manner of response. I knew that Gary was in. I barely needed to probe his answer for semantics, but for that feeling of discontent. His body was here, but his mind had accessed a different plane. Good, stick around," I told him. "I'll be joining you in a few minutes." There was a brief pause before Gary responded. "All right. I'll just float around," he said flatly. I sat up and shut off the television. Gary's technique involved the use of constant droning frequencies, hence the static. Mine did not. I lay back, closed my eyes, and began my own ritual, which many in the community know as the dimensions of visualization. This ritual involves visualizing each of the 3 core components of what one perceives to be the self, the unconscious, corporeal body, The nebulous, one slowly stretching out, materializing above its physical counterpart, and the soul chain which binds them both. When I had finished rendering that image of the trilogy, I focused my energies on the next stage of the process. I concentrated deeply on the body which occupied the material world, imagined it rising slowly and in one motion. I hurled my consciousness into the immaterial body. I had done it. I gave myself a moment to adjust to the odd sensations. It had been remarkably fast. My vision cleared, and I was greeted to the familiar image of the dark little room, with Gary floating above his material body in the same nebulous from as I, his spectral form giving off a faint glow. That certainly didn't take you long. You're bound to have broken some sort of record there. I suppose that's what happens when you've been practicing as long as I have, I said, smiling. It was odd, though. Gary noting how quickly I had done it. Gary, while not as talented in projecting as some of the other higher-ups, had proven to be an excellent coordinator. He had links across the world and had documented various findings, and conducted many studies into astral projection, or remote viewing, as he often insisted on calling it. He was something of an authority figure in a small but fast-growing community. I suppose that's why I had drove 2 hours to meet him in the first place. Well, I suppose we'll get on with it. And Gary mumbled something of a low agreement. Gary and I stood abreast, gathering our minds' respective energies, letting them splay out against each other and warp to form a sort of bubble, a type of mental cocoon that would link us, keep us together throughout the voyage. So then, the moon, was it? There was a low, incredulous note to Gary's question. I've never been there myself, though you know I'm not one for space travel. Yeah, try to focus on your form now, and lean and secure its energy into my own. I'll take it from there. When Gary had anchored his energy to my own, I began to cast my thoughts to the moon. It was never easy to shift your mind from one place to another, especially over such a great distance, but I had done it before. I visualized the pallor of the alien landscape, and the light outside the cocoon slowly began to warp, as if being stretched and swirled like some sort of cosmic tie-dye, and with a sudden, increased tightening of the light, the shift occurred. The light outside the cocoon began to unfold itself, sharpening into a perceptible image of a vast, ivory landscape pressing harshly against a black, star-specked void. Follow me. I'll take you to the site of incident. Gary and I began to walk, still encapsulated in our bubble. So, this is the moon, Gary said. No giant soul arm. Giant soul arm? Yeah, there was a rumor going around a few years back about there being some sort of odd artificial construction on the moon. A giant mechanical arm that would pick up any cosmic travelers, such as ourselves, and throw them back to their bodies on Earth. They said that the US government set it up when they got here in 1969, probably to stop us from seeing something they were trying to keep wrapped up. I suppose the rumor was hard to believe, considering we've only really had verified claims of space travel in the last decade or so. The moon seems to have a lot of weird rumors surrounding it. That's probably the reason the council was skeptical of my report. Probably. We continued our walk for what may have been 60 minutes. The stars were bright, and the light that reflected from the lunar surface would have blinded us, would have seared our retinas had we been in a physical sense. The light was processed not physically, but mentally, through different wavelengths of observation than that of raw biological photosensitivity. I remember feeling unsettled yet inspired. Mankind had conquered all manner of climate on Earth, and now We had conquered even the imposing sterility of this vast satellite. We soon crested the rim of a large crater, the site of incident, and Gary saw firsthand the strange activity I had described in my report. In the hundreds, or even thousands, tall, shadowy beings stood within the depths of the hollow. Each of the beings' long, wispy limbs seemed to undulate, constrict, and dilate in haphazard rhythms. The pigmentation in their bodies took on hues of gray and black. The coloration, alongside that unnatural jittery motion of the limbs, gave the impression of TV static. Astral beings. But why so many? That's what I hoped you could tell me. Gary took a moment to watch the odd gathering of entities. He seemed visibly unsettled. The council seems to reckon there's about 28 types, or species. Gary paused again, looking into the crater, analyzing the curious forms of each of the beings. But this type doesn't look familiar at all, and across all the documented types, there have never been gatherings of this size. I looked at the huge gathering down in the crater. A small number of the beings appeared to be looking in our direction, but the strange contractions of their bodies made it hard to tell. Gary, I don't say this to cause any further panic, but to me, it looks like there are more of them now than there was when I first made the incident report. Strange. Have you tried communicating with them? No. I think we should try. If they don't seem like the talkative sort, worst case scenario is we've wasted another 10 minutes climbing down there. We stepped down the edge of the crater at a steep angle, but it was no trouble for us. After all, gravity did not affect us in this state. We could have hovered down if we wanted. As we continued to descend the crater, I felt gripped by the sense of a dread that seemed to grow in intensity as we got lower down. The deepest recesses of the crater were shrouded in a strange, impenetrable blackness. It was like a weeping sore, one that oozed thick black pus. It didn't seem right that such thick shadow could gather in the harsh sunlight, but I pushed those thoughts down, ignoring them. We continued our descent. Not far away from our path, one of the beings stood away from the others, facing into the dark hollow. Gary commented on the odd sense of dread that the gathering seemed to evoke. Because of this, we decided that this lone entity would be ideal, and perhaps safer, for making contact. Gary also suggested that only one of us should approach it. It might see the both of us sauntering up to it as aggressive, and then we'll definitely not get anything out of it, he said. As for the matter of who would make contact, we agreed on a game of rock, paper, scissors. Rock, paper, scissors. My hand splayed out flat, met with Gary's balled fist, and covered it. Gary sighed. All right, I won't be a minute. Stick around here. All right, I said. I broke down the bubble which secured us together, and he began to steady plod toward the creature. Soon after, I was able to pick up on the low sound of Gary projecting his thoughts in the being's direction. Not in English, but a language of pure thought. One that the dark entity would have a better chance of understanding. He sent out a greeting in the being's direction. It did not exchange the greeting, it simply responded by turning and facing him. The two stood still for a moment, simply looking at each other. Gary sent out another greeting. That's when I noticed that the rhythm of contractions in the astral being's body started to grow in rapidity. The wispy limbs flared in a manner that appeared aggressive. The being's shadowy, poorly defined face wrenched backward in a motion that looked painful. Great rips started to form. The crevices in the creature's head grew longer and wider. As they expanded, they ran into each other, becoming a singular large tear across the creature's head. This created the impression of a mouth, one that was shredded and mangled. That was when the screaming started. Gary stood motionless, as if completely stunned. The astral being continued to emit deep, garbled waves that made me feel disoriented, even from where I stood. "Gary, come on, we have to go," I called out, all the while trying to maintain my composure. But Gary wouldn't move, and the crowd of beings toward the bottom of the crater had taken notice of me. They began to shamble in my direction, and as they got closer, the feeling of disorientation only intensified. Their bodies pulsed with the same aggressive rapidity that the screamers did. Things were getting dangerous, and panic set in. I knew that my heart would be beating dangerously fast back on Earth. I tried to return to my body so that I could wake Gary up and bring him back. But something was wrong. I couldn't go back. The cause became apparent. It was that distorted cry that the creatures emitted. Those horrible sounds seemed to shake the connection between the physical and metaphysical body. They seemed to corrode the soul chain itself. Without even thinking, I ran and ran and ran. Luckily, the beings didn't move very fast and seemed to give up on their chase once I had ascended the crater's edge. I had managed to escape. When I had got far away enough from the crater, I found that I was able to return to my body, no longer discombobulated by the crazed screaming. I jolted upright as my consciousness returned to my body. I took long, deep breaths as my mind raced with thoughts of the screamers, their horrible wailing, and that impossibly dark mass of shadows at the crater's lowest point. And another thought. Gary. I turned, grabbed him by the shoulders, and shook him hard. I kept shaking. He was breathing and his pulse remained steady, but he didn't respond. I kept on shaking and shaking. No response. A few days later, I sent my final report to the council. Simon, another of the higher-ups, treated the matter with a degree of seriousness on account of Gary's disappearance. I made my terms clear. I wouldn't bring Simon to the moon. I wouldn't be going back to that damn satellite. And I certainly wouldn't be going anywhere near the infested crater. Simon smiled. "Not to worry. I'll be able to make the journey myself. You did well supplying the information." Simon's form took on a myriad of brilliant hues as the light bent and folded around him. A second later, he was gone. I don't participate in the community much nowadays, but to my knowledge, he hasn't been seen since. I rarely astral project nowadays, and when I do, I never leave the planet. Instead, I travel to the hospital where Gary now lives, if such a grim state of survival can be considered living. Permanently lying in a comatose state. I can't bring myself to go in person. His family visit him regularly. I see them often. Although the visits have been getting less frequent as the months keep rolling by, if you are a practitioner of astral projection or remote viewing, I urge that you heed this warning. Stay away from the moon. Hello, my name is Elijah and I am 18. When I finish this post and upload it online, I am most likely not around anymore. Or maybe I'm okay. I have no clue what they mean by fired. I've been working at my job in the fast food industry for 3 years now, and I've seen a lot. From terrible customers and troublesome crew, and all the standard customer service experiences. But nothing has ever been this strange or weird. I don't want to talk about myself much, but I'm yet to enroll into college, and I aspire to be a coder. I hope people don't forget about me. Anyways, I was just home in my rundown apartment, just chilling on my couch watching some Netflix. I can't particularly remember what show at the moment, but that doesn't really matter. I do remember how I was startled from the sudden buzzing of my phone. I was hoping when I lifted it up to my face my work number wouldn't appear. Of course it was them. They needed me to fill in for somebody. However, this was majorly different from before. I was being offered double my pay. Now this sounds too good to be true. It wasn't time and a half. It wasn't some holiday. No, just a typical day. Well, if a snowstorm counts as typical. So being the broke, non-college student I am, I had to take the shift. Rent is due soon and I need any pocket money I can get. So I'm quick to press the off button for my TV and get all my work clothes. The shirt, the hat, just some basic black jeans, and the pin with my name. Since there is a storm, I also made sure to put on boots and a jacket, and I carried my work shoes in some plastic bag. At first I was pretty fine with working. It was only 6:30 to 10:30. 4 hours, nothing more, nothing less. Plus, my friend Elliot was there. We started working together and I've been best friends ever since. I consider him to be my best friend, actually. I unlocked my apartment door and instantly, a heavy snowfall came rushing in, like it was wanting shelter from this terrible cold as well. I walk out and close the door behind me, making sure to lock it, and I rush down my apartment stairs. I nearly tripped, actually. My hands were feeling extremely cold already, and my car window needed some defrosting and also some time for the windshield wipers to actually clear everything off. To speed everything up, I do a quick wipe with my right coat, trying not to get any on my hand on the front side window. Then I move to the back to wipe off the rear side window a bit. After that, I just unlock my car and swiftly enter to get away from everything going on outside. I can't believe I am going to work with the weather like this. Well, double pay was worth it at the time. I remember thinking. I put my car keys into the ignition and started my car, putting my plastic bag onto the passenger seat as well. I set my AC to blast heat and turned the windshield wipers on. My seat is getting wet since the snow is melting already. I wait a couple minutes before putting my seatbelt on, backing up, and driving to work. Nothing of significance really did end up happening, just the constant pattering of snow on my window and how fast my view would have been covered. I'm lucky technology is so great. In due time, I make it to work. I turn off my car and remove the keys from the ignition, grab my bag, get out of my car, and just close the door. And I couldn't forget to lock it. The snow already started slamming down onto me, so I just ran inside and got to the break room quickly. I switched into my work shoes but kept my coat on and clocked in. Apparently my job for today was just drive-through, and just that. Which was a boring one, but being honest, I really looked at my phone a lot during drive-through times. I've worked through this place for a while. I could immediately tell if something different were to appear, just like someone who lived in a house for a long time could tell if something moved or if something was gone. That's when I saw it. Under the trash can, it said, "For Elijah." Being curious, I picked up the paper and began reading. I don't have the paper on me, so I'm writing how I remember it. I wasn't allowed to bring it home. Also, P.S., there's so many scratched out words I recall. I think it's just for my name. "Hello, Elijah. We from the management team are glad you made it. Tonight is a special night. You were offered double pay, yeah? Well, you have to earn it. Follow these simple rules, and you'll get through this shift easily. Rule 1. Pay attention to the time. Strangely enough, the clock seems to stop or just seem off sometimes. Please immediately call a manager over to fix this issue. If you don't have this issue fixed within 10 minutes of this problem occurring, strange things will happen if you don't fix it, and you will be immediately fired. Rule 2. Under no circumstances are you to serve any customers driving black vans, trucks, and so on. To be more specific, between 7 to 8 is a period where the more tricky customers come out. You must ignore them if they drive to your window. No exceptions. If you do answer one of these people, you will be immediately fired. Rule 3. If anyone comes to your window, not inside a car, look for anything wrong immediately. They may look normal, but we assure you, they aren't. However, some of these people may just be normal, so please talk to them. Just look out for anything that seems off when someone knocks. If you answer one of these people, you will be immediately fired. Rule 4. Don't leave the drive-through window open or ajar. I need not explain. You are inviting them in. You will be immediately fired. Rule 5. Please look out for Jeff. Jeff doesn't work here. Sometimes he stops by after a crew member makes a mistake with a specific rule. Please inform a manager if you spot him. He has orange hair, freckles, glasses, and lots of ring jewelry. Specifically silver and gold. If you spot Jeff and don't call it in, you will be immediately fired. Rule 6. Never leave change on the floor if any are dropped. Some may take that as payment and would like more. We hate losing money, so if you do, you'll be immediately fired. Rule 7. Do not leave your station unless a manager told you so. Sometimes a crew member may attempt to get you to leave your station, and may say the manager told you to switch. This is a lie. Don't leave your station. If you do, you'll be immediately fired. Rule 8. Lastly, never tell friends, family, or anyone about this list. If you do, you'll be immediately fired. We wish you luck, Elijah. If you'd like more hours, just call a manager and ask for them. We are working past closing hours tonight. Thank you for your great effort and amazing work. I finished reading and immediately thought about how dumb of a joke it was, but then a loud thud from the window scared me. I definitely was startled. A man standing outside with a coat and, oddly enough, wearing shorts. He was saying stuff about wanting to order, and can he order? My hand reached for the handle when it froze. I nearly forgot about Rule 3. This man was weird. It's a snowstorm out there and he's wearing shorts. I recall thinking something like, wait, is this rule stuff real then? Eventually, after tons of banging and desperate scratches at the window, I could tell something wasn't normal about the guy. Eventually, he moved on to the next window to barrage another crew member, a girl. I won't tell her name, so I'll just say Alice. Well, she ignored him too. This is like the only time I will mention her. She isn't important. So, are we getting the same rules? Why can't we talk about it? And why get fired for not following some dumb rules? I sigh, then look at the time. 10:30. My shift is over? No, impossible. I'm lucky I immediately called a manager over, and yeah, the time was wrong. What's with this stuff? I'm not covering the boring business. It was snowing, and I was working at drive-thru. For most of the time, I was just reporting the weird times and checking my phone like usual when a sudden rush at 8 p.m. appeared. There were plenty of white cars appearing. Only white, actually. They weren't white from the snow, though, of course. I nearly forgot about the second rule when a black car appeared. It wasn't a hard rule. Just ignore them. They'll either stop at the windows or drive off immediately. It wasn't much of an issue. It was just like the people. Until later in the night when the people, not the cars, became harder to spot. Some of them looked alright, and I actually had to stand up tall just to notice how their shoes are either weird or not suited for the weather. I swear sometimes I just got paranoid and didn't answer for real people. But hopefully there wasn't an issue for that, I hope. I was chilling when my friend Elliot walked up to my station, never entering though. Yo, Elliot, what's up, my man? I immediately spoke out to him. Elliot smiled and spoke back. Man, I'm doing terrible. So cold. I'm just here to switch with you. Elliot responded somewhat casually, I think. Yet I didn't budge. Those rules don't leave my mind. I can't switch with a crew member, and even though I know him, I didn't move. I couldn't move. A statue just stuck in the same position. Come on, man. We can switch. We're cool. Best bros. Just step out. No. I didn't speak to Elliot. He's trying to get me to break the rules. I want this job. No, I need this job. I remember thinking that. I don't quite believe this job actually is for me anymore, though. I outright ignored Elliot, and when my shift ended, I went home just like that. That weird night was over, and a month has passed since then. I called work and asked about Elliot. He was fired, apparently earlier into his shift for trash-talking crew members. That isn't possible, though. Elliot would definitely not do that. But I'm sure I also saw him. He wanted me to leave my station. I checked through my texts with him. Me and him casually discuss our shifts and duties and, well, I'll just put our messages here. 2:55 p.m. Elliot. You working today? Anyway, between 3 to 9, I'm free for there today. Unlucky. Me to Elliot. I think you mean lucky me. Drive-through duty today. It's a snowstorm, though. Bring a coat, bud. Of course. See you later, man. I don't want to push onwards, but it made sense to me. That out of the blue, call to work, the scratched words, and also just him being fired. He broke a rule. Was he fired? I've texted and called, and Elliot is now confirmed missing. I haven't gone to work now, so here I am. My rent is due soon. I don't have enough money for it, so I'm typing this all for you now. I don't know what will happen to me. Most likely whatever happened to my friend. Gone and missing. Please don't forget me. Don't forget my friend either. I wonder what awaits. Death? Who would have thought working at some fast food place was this crazy? I already hear knocks at my door. They know. They are here for me. Perhaps I should start from the beginning. I was a little disgruntled when I was given an assignment in the village that's notorious for being Finland's most desolate place. Polanka. Look it up. It is certainly not the location that comes to mind when people think of Christmas. Lapland is the popular tourist destination in Finland. I was sent to Polanka with a cameraman to interview residents for a fluff piece about remote villages. I was a journalist from the sunny city of Los Angeles. The two places are worlds apart, and we were supposed to be there for a month. An entire month. Moreover, the month was December. I had to spend Christmas in the middle of nowhere. The year was 2005. I was a young woman. That's a good thing in the media industry. At first, however, it's a little rough. You have to do the stories that nobody wants to hear before you get to do the big ones. Those first few weeks in Polanka were tiresome. I was bored. My cameraman Steven was bored. The residents I interviewed were bored. We were staying at a small B&B. The couple running the establishment were actually very friendly. That's why my interview with them was so unexpectedly distressing. I've left out their names for legal reasons. It's nearly Christmas Day, I said. Are there any festivities planned? The village is so quiet. Oh, the husband said. Yeah, Christmas Day is celebrated, but it's also feared. Feared? What do you mean? I asked, smiling at what I assumed to either be a joke or the Finnish man's broken English. I think I should warn you to treat that day differently in this village, he said. Please, Heather, make sure you and Stephen are asleep before midnight on Christmas Day. Do not wake until 6 a.m. at the earliest. Why is that? I pressed, trembling. At this point, it was only the husband's new, sinister demeanor that gave me any cause for concern. As he spoke, his breath seemed to fill the air with an icy chill. His brown eyes, which had previously seemed so warm, were filled with a blackness that haunted me to my core. We do not stir between the hours of midnight and 6 a.m. on Christmas Day, he repeated. The wife sat there quietly. Her smile had rapidly departed her face. I wrapped up the interview, and Stephen teased me relentlessly over the next few days. What do we think? Evil Santa? Krampus? Stephen inquired, chortling. Stop it, Stephen, I scolded. I'm not scared of anything supernatural. I'm scared of him. He seemed so friendly for the first few weeks. Did you see how cold and robotic he became? They're just superstitious people, Heather, Stephen said. We'll just have to party a little more quietly in our room when the clock strikes midnight, won't we? What? I replied, gasping. You're not going to disobey his rule. I don't want that creepy couple to come in here and hack us to pieces. Stephen smiled, wrapping his arms around me. He gave me a soft peck on the forehead. You've not gone off me, have you? He asked, affectionately booping my nose. Nope. For that to happen, I'd have to fancy you. I replied, grinning. He was an asshole, and there was no doubt about that, but Stephen did have a way of putting me at ease. Our fling didn't have any real depth, but I trusted the guy. I trusted that I was just being silly. There was nothing to fear. They were just a friendly, superstitious couple. Still, that night, I saw the old man's black, haunting eyes in my dreams. I wasn't fully convinced by Stephen's words, but I tried my best to move past the uncomfortable interview. The husband returned to his pleasant self over the coming days. Christmas Eve was actually surprisingly fun. The wife cooked a feast, as we were the only guests at the B&B, and the four of us danced to festive music. I decided the frightening interview had been a misunderstanding. Have you had enough to eat and drink? The wife asked later in the evening. Yeah, thanks, I replied. The meal was delicious. Thank you, dear, but it is now 9 p.m., she said. We must all go to bed. Stephen snorted with laughter. Careful, lady. I don't know you that well. I smacked him in the arm. This is later than we usually retire on Christmas Eve. We have taken a risk to give you a pleasant evening. Now please, we must all go to sleep, the husband said curtly. I thought you said midnight, Stephen replied, swigging his drink. You must be asleep by midnight, the husband explained. I have no doubt that 3 hours is more than enough time to drift off, but it is better to err on the side of caution. I shot Stephen a look. He knew my looks well. Okay, Stephen drunkenly slurred, raising his hands. You're the man. He giggled obnoxiously as we climbed the stairs to bed, and I apologized profusely to the couple, but they shrugged it off. They understood that Stephen was simply a little too inebriated. I felt guilty for previously being so creeped out by the husband. He had returned to his friendly self. In hindsight, I realized he was probably just relieved that we were going to bed early. Don't be so sour. Stephen chuckled, hugging me from behind. I pushed him off, clambering into bed. Wait, you're not seriously going to sleep, are you? Stephen laughed, looking at his watch. It's 9:14 p.m., Heather. I'm respecting their one rule. I replied, tucking myself under the duvet. Suit yourself. Stephen shrugged. I'll just watch TV on the lowest volume and keep drinking. Please get in bed, I requested. I'm sure I'll pass out before midnight. He chuckled. Don't worry. I won't get us into any trouble with the spooky owners. I don't remember falling asleep. What I do remember is waking up. That, in fact, is something I cannot forget. I opened my eyes. There was some sort of commotion outside the window. I checked the alarm clock on my bedside table. 4:07 a.m. I had woken up too early. I had a vision of the terrifying old man. I pictured him charging into our room and butchering us in bed for disobeying his rule. Stephen? I whispered into the darkness. He wasn't in bed. He wasn't in the armchair in front of the small TV. He wasn't anywhere in the room. I heard footsteps outside. Snow was crunching beneath feet. There was a muffled voice. It sounded like screaming. I scrambled out of bed and ran to the window, tearing the curtains open, and saw something that still haunts my very waking and sleeping hour. Wading through the snow, an 8-foot-tall abomination left a trail from the front door of the B&B. It was a hulking figure, unlike any earthly creature I'd ever seen. Its skin was black. I still don't know whether I was more horrified by this monstrosity or the half-alive body of the cameraman that it was dragging through the snow. Stephen would have been able to see me standing in the window, but his eyelids appeared to be sewn shut. I realized his mouth was also sewn shut, which explained the muffled screams. He was missing all 4 of his limbs, but there was not a spot of blood on him. It seemed his limbless torso also had its wounds neatly stitched up. The only mess he left behind was a yellow trail of urine. I clasped my hand to my mouth, futilely attempting to mute the sound of my tortured wail. It was no use. The creature stopped walking. Unclenching its right claw, the being dropped Stephen's near-lifeless body into the snow. The demonic creature slowly turned around to look at the window. Perhaps it had not even heard me. Perhaps it had just sensed that, like Stephen, I was not in bed. I had broken the rule. The being's face was crimson red and floated in the center of its pitch-black head. The thing had no eyes, but I know it saw everything. It somehow sensed I was awake. The creature's mouth was stretched into a wide, toothy grin that curved from one side of its face to the other. I unleashed a primal scream into the sweaty palm of my hand. My eyes swilled with tears as I stared into the featureless face of the thing I was sure would kill me. The being started to walk back towards the bed and breakfast. I leapt away from the curtains, tripping backwards over the bed. I needed to fall asleep, but I only had seconds to do so. Even if I hadn't been in a state of sheer panic, it would have been near impossible to achieve that. Suddenly, I had an idea. It was a bad idea, but it was the only option. I knew how to make sure I wouldn't be awake when the creature reached my room. I had to knock myself out. I could have held my breath, but that would have taken too long. I heard the front door of the building open and close. There were heavy footsteps on the creaky floorboards of the downstairs hallway. I did a dangerous thing. Obviously, it's not something I'd advise anyone else to do. I could hear the stairs creaking. The creature was getting closer. My heart was pounding. I hoped I would pass out from fear. I backed away from the window to get a running start. Then I sprinted towards it. At the last second, I lunged for the windowsill, ensuring that my head made contact with its sharp corner. When I woke, it was morning. It worked. My crazy plan worked. I was alive. I had an obscenely large lump on the side of my head, but I was alive. The bump didn't kill me, and the creature didn't kill me. I thought for a fleeting moment that the whole thing might have been a dream, but when I clambered to my feet, I received a horrifying confirmation of what had transpired during the early hours of the morning. There was a trail through the snow. It was the width of a human body. It led far from the village and vanished beyond the visible horizon. Stephen was gone. "Merry Christmas." The somber voice came from behind me. I turned to face the old man, who was standing in my open doorway. It was so many years ago, but I don't remember opening the door. Perhaps the creature entered my room. Perhaps it checked that I was not awake. I bought a bus ticket to Helsinki Airport. The old man said, "Just one." I didn't say a word to that old couple. I left Stephen's things behind. I told our company that he went missing. There were search parties, police investigations, and so on. He was never found. 17 years later, I don't travel. I know I'm far away from there, but I still dream of that horrendous, red-faced creature. I fear Christmas just as the old man did. I live in Los Angeles, but I still don't stay up past midnight on Christmas Day.